Welcome everybody to my live session on how to build your own API by using Flask. We're going to be using Python and Flask, and I'm going to be showing you all the dependencies that you need to build a very basic API. And by the end of this, you'll be able to almost just copy and paste this entire API and paste it into any of your other projects and use it for your own database for that project. All you have to do is copy and paste and then install these dependencies again, and you should be good to go. And then just make some different alterations if you ever needed to. So let's go ahead and get started. I want you to create a new project. I'm just going to add a new file. So make sure you create some kind of file, and I'll just do it inside of my Python here. My first Flask. Hit enter, and then inside of here I'm going to create a new file, and I'm just going to call it my first flask.py. That .py is important because it's telling your compiler that this needs to be read as a Python file, and we want to make sure that we have something called pipenv installed so that everything will work nicely so that we can install the rest of these dependencies. So I'm just going to say pip install pip env, like this. So make sure the spelling is exactly like this. Make sure you're doing this in your terminal. You could be doing this in Pycharm or in Visual Studio. It doesn't matter, but wherever your terminal is, go ahead and run that. Now I've already got it installed, so it's already gonna say requirement already satisfied, but as long as you don't run into any errors, you should be good to go. So now we're going to install pip3 so that we can install even more dependencies to our Flask. So we're gonna say pip env -- and then spell out 3 like this. Hit enter. And as you can see, it actually created a pip file, but it did it outside of my directory that I wanted it to install. So that was my bad. Let's go ahead and delete that. And I'm going to make sure that I cd into that file. So let's see where I'm at right now. I'm going to say ls. So I need to cd into Python. ls, let me see where there it is, my first Flask. So I need to do cd my first Flask. So I'm glad that we caught that, because if we didn't, then we would have installed those dependencies in a wrong place. Now that I'm in the correct directory, let's go ahead and do pip env -- again. Hit enter, and now it's installing. Now you can see that there's something called pip file inside of the correct directory now. So good job if you got through that. And this session is going to be up after the live session so that you can actually rewind and pause if you ever needed to. So don't worry if you feel like you're falling behind at all. So after we confirm that we have our pip file now, let's go back here and we are going to install Flask. So I'm going to say pip install Flask. And mine already says that I already have it installed, so that's just fine. But now that we have it, let's go back over here, and inside of my first flask.py file, let's go ahead and import Flask. So we're just going to say from Flask import Flask, and make sure it's this exact spelling with the same casing. So from lowercase Flask import Flask with an uppercase F. Now we're going to take an instance of Flask and we are going to put it into a variable called my app. So I want you to create a new variable called my_app, and we are going to say Flask and __ name, and this will create that instance inside of my app for us. Perfect. Now we're going to create a decorator so that we can use routes in Flask. So our routes will help determine whether we want to store something, edit something, delete something inside of our database. So let's create a test route. So we're going to do our decorator with the @ symbol, and I'm going to say my app.route, or whatever variable you named up here needs to be the same down here. I would highly suggest just doing the same exact naming variables and conventions that I am doing. So let's create a route, and we'll do a base route. So this is just going to be a / inside of a string. And then inside of there, we are going to now do a function, and we're going to call this test route. Okay, and we're just gonna make this a very, very simple one. We just wanna make sure that our API runs on the server. So we're just going to return something simple like a string, and I'm just gonna say hello from my API. Okay, and we're gonna make sure that this main file runs. So we're going to say if underscore underscore name is the same as underscore underscore main underscore underscore, then I want you to run my app. So my app dot run, and then we're gonna set debug to true. Okay, so now we're going to test our API so far just to make sure that it is running. So inside of your terminal, we are going to get into our pipenv shell. So inside of your terminal, we're just gonna say pip env shell. And if that worked, it will have the name of your file next to maybe your username or something like that. But that's how you're gonna know that you're inside of your shell. And we are going to now run our file. So this is Python, so we're gonna say Python space, now the name of your file, which is my first flask.py, hit enter. And it didn't look like I had Flask installed, so make sure that you're inside of your pipenv shell when you import Flask. So that was my bad. So with Flask installed, now let's try running this. I'm just gonna use my up arrow keys to find the commands that I've done before. Okay, so this gave us a little bit of a warning, which is fine. You can ignore that. As long as you have this right here, it says debugger is active, then that should be running just fine. So it even gives you a little bit of a link here. And so I'm just gonna control click, command click, and it popped up on my other screen. Let me bring it into view for you. But now it says hello from my API, and this is live in my browser right now. So that debugger is live. And the reason why it's saying hello from my API is because that's what we said right here. Hello from my API. So that is working nicely. And I can say, and hello from the database. I can change it, and this should go live again. So if I hit refresh on my browser, now it says hello from the database. So that is working nicely. And of course, if you run into any errors and it doesn't say debugger is active, that is just fine. Just make sure that you pause the video and go back and fix those errors. Remember, your terminal should say what the error is, typically towards the bottom of the error. So just follow it and make sure that you have everything exactly as I have, because it is now working. We are now going to install something called SQL Alchemy. This will allow us to not have to use SQL code without having to write pure SQL code, making it easier to both write and read SQL inside of our Python. If you've ever written SQL before, you know that it is very different than Python, and it can be difficult to understand. So this will make it easier for us. So let's go ahead and install those. And after we install SQL Alchemy, we're going to install something called Marshmallow. If you ever had to mess with JSON data before, you already know that is very messy and it can be very confusing to look at. So Marshmallow will simplify our JSON and allow us to write more simple code. When it comes to writing our own APIs, it can start to look very complex. So finding tools such as these will help simplify our code, and the more simple you can make your code, the better your code's gonna be. And then finally, what we're going to do after that is that we are going to install something called Marshmallow SQL Alchemy, which is actually connecting both of the first two dependencies that I just talked about with SQL Alchemy and then with Marshmallow, and it's gonna allow them to communicate. So let's go ahead and install those dependencies. So if your debugger is still active, just do Control-C, and that will close your server. And we're going to start with the Flask SQL Alchemy. So let's do pip env install Flask SQL Alchemy. So make sure that your casing is exactly the same. So capital F, capital SQLA. And if you did that right, it should start to install. If you run into any errors, like maybe you spelt it incorrectly, it will not ruin your program or anything. All you have to do is try retyping it again. Depending on your internet connection, that should only take less than a minute. Okay, it looks like that worked just fine. So just by doing that, you can see that I now have a new file called pip_file.lock. Okay, and if I look at my pip file, I now have a new dependency called Flask SQL Alchemy. Awesome. So if there weren't any errors, let's go ahead and install the next one. So let's do pip env install. Now we're going to do marshmallow. So let's do flask-marshmallow. And that is all lowercase that time. So let's see if I typed it in right and let it install. Perfect. Now you can see that already Flask Marshmallow had showed up inside of my packages, inside of my pip file. And it is just finishing up. Success, updating pip file. Perfect. Now let's do our last one, pip env install marshmallow dash SQL Alchemy, which is all lowercase again, and hit enter and let that install. So that's already being updated inside of here. Okay, and that has been successful. So if all three of those are successful, then let's go ahead and start importing them into our projects. So I'm going to say from Flask SQL Alchemy import capital SQL Alchemy. Okay, so make sure your casing is just like this. Hopefully I did that right. My spelling's not super great. And then now we're going to do marshmallow. So from Flask marshmallow import marshmallow with a capital M. So marshmallow, just like that. Okay, and then we are going to import just one more, import OS. Good job. If you got that all imported, let's just make sure that our file is running just fine without any errors. So we're going to make sure our server is closed, and we're going to do Python my first flask.py, and let's make sure that that is still running. My server does say that the debugger is active, and if I click that, it does successfully bring up my hello from the database again. So that is working great. So let's go ahead and close our servers by doing Control-C. And let's go to the next part. We're going to start creating our first schema. So you might hate me, but we're actually going to delete this part right here. This was just for testing, make sure our API was working and active. So let's delete that. And now we are going to do our new schema. So Flask needs to know where to save our database. So we need to give it some kind of base file. So we're going to call this base_file. And we're going to say os.path.abspath, which means absolute path. And that is a function. So that's going to take os.path.dir_name. In other words, the directory name. So whatever the name of the file is, it's going to take that. Sorry, I just messed that up. __, and then your parentheses, okay? And then this part is telling your database where exactly, where to save your file. And now we are going to give it a testing database, something called Sqlite. So I'm gonna say my app. So make sure it's the same name as this up here. My app.config, and it's going to be looking for your URI. So let's give it SQL Alchemy _database _URI. So that's in all caps. Make sure you do that. And we're gonna set this equal to Sqlite dash dash dash. Make sure there are 3. And we are going to combine that with the path, so os.path.join. And we're going to join the base file. Let's see, base file, comma, inside of string, let's do app dot Sqlite. Just like that. So if that looks confusing or intimidating at all, don't worry. This can be confusing at first, but again, you pretty much just have to write this one time and you can pretty much just copy and paste this elsewhere. But this will start to make more sense after maybe the second time you write your own API, and that will be nice. So with Sqlite, it's more like a testing database. So this will actually only store your data for like a couple days, I think it is. I don't remember exactly how long. But if you ever wanted to have more of a long-term database, then you can definitely get that from Heroku. If that is something that you are interested in, please drop a like. And if I get enough likes, I will go ahead and make a new video for you guys and show you guys how to get that Heroku URI so that you can not have any of your stuff deleted after a couple of days with Sqlite. So that will be really cool. So once we have those, let's create a couple of variables to store our database and as well as Marshmallow. So we're gonna call this next one DB. And we're gonna say DB equals SQL Alchemy. And inside of there, we are going to send it my app. And then we are going to do Marshmallow and make it a little bit more simple for us. We'll just call this Marsh equals Marshmallow and also send it my app. So now that we have the two objects, DB and Marsh, let's create our first schema data table. I want to have a database that stores different coding projects I've written so that others can see them. So that's the kind of API I'm going to create. So let's create a schema where I can choose what data I want, such as maybe a title, link, or maybe even an image of my projects so that people can see them. Let's just keep this simple, and I'm just going to do maybe just a title and a link. So let's create a class, and I'm going to call this project because remember, I'm creating a database that will store all of my projects. So each one will be called projects. And we're going to do db.model. And then we are going to set up an ID using our SQL Alchemy. So we're going to say ID equals database, so our DB object right here, dot column. And inside there, we're going to do db.string. So again, if you have done SQL before, this should start to sound a little bit familiar. And this is an ID, so we don't want a string. We do want an integer. And then we're going to set the primary key to a Boolean of true. Okay, so this creates a column in your table. Then we want a type of integer. And a primary key will actually tell Flask to make sure that this ID is unique. And it will auto increment for us so that if I create a new project in my website, then it's going to set that first project as an ID of 1. And then when I create a new project, it will automatically set that ID as ID 2. And then 3 and 4, and it'll just keep going on forever and ever until I'm done creating more projects. It's nice that it'll do that for us automatically so that we don't have to do it manually. So now, like I said, I want to have my projects each have a title and a link. So let's create a variable called title, and let's do database.column. We're going to do almost the same thing. And then db.string because I want the title just to be a string. And we're going to tell it the max amount of characters that we can have for our string. I don't want it to be more than 100 characters. That would be a very long title if it was any longer than that. And we are going to let it know that we don't want this to be unique. So let's make sure I spelled that right. So unique equals false. And then finally our link. So let's set our link to db.column, db.string, make sure that's capitalized. And then sometimes my links are pretty long, so just in case, I'm just going to make that a little bit longer, like 300 characters, comma, unique, false. Okay. And then we do need to have a constructor called every time that our front end is asking for us to render each of our projects. So the constructor that we're going to create will always be called whenever that object is created. So we're going to call a function, and we're going to say init, and we're going to say self, title, and then link. So if you do have more of these, make sure that you include them down here as well. And we are going to assign these so that our classes can read them. So we're going to say self.title equals title. And then same with link, self.link equals link. And now we're going to create that schema using Marshmallow, and we will give it access to our title and our link. So let's come all the way to the left, make sure you're not inside of that project anymore. So we're going to say class project schema marsh.schema. Okay, so now we're accessing our Marshmallow object there, and we are going to nest another class. So class meta, and we are going to give it some fields. So let's call this fields equals a tuple. So inside of this tuple, we are going to give it our title and our link. So let's do title, and then whatever the link is will be stored inside of fields. We are almost done with this section. So we're almost to our testing stage. So let's come all the way to the left over here, and let's create an instance of the project schema. So I'm going to say project schema, and that's going to be singular in case I want to handle any projects individually. So this will be equal to my project schema. Okay, so this right here. And then we're going to set one more in case we want to handle multiple items at the same time. So we're going to say projects with an S now, projects, let me spell that right, projects schema, and this will be project schema, and we're going to let it know that we want multiple of them whenever we're messing with plural project schema. So we're going to say many equals true. And now we should be able to test this and make sure that it is working. So in order to test this now, let's get into our Python REPL. So in our terminal, we're now going to type just Python. And as long as you see these three arrows right here, you are inside of your Python REPL. And inside of there, we are going to say from the name of our file, which is my-first-flask.py, import db. Okay, and I noticed that it does not like the fact that I have these dashes, so it's giving me a syntax error. So I just renamed it from my-first-flask.py to my-first-flask. I'm just using camel casing. So once you do that, then we'll do from my-first-flask import db. And if it gives you this little bit of a warning, it's okay, there's nothing wrong with that, but we are up to our next part, so don't worry about that. If you don't have any more errors, then we will go to our next part. So let's do db.create_all, and that's a function. And once you hit this, it should be giving you a new file. So once I hit enter, now you can see that this just popped up, app.sqlite. And if you look in here, I won't have anything quite yet, but there's not going to be much to look at in there, but that should be it. So to get out of your Python REPL, we'll just do Control D. So everything that we did is our base code or skeleton code for how most of our basic databases are going to be built. So that is going to be awesome. We are now going to create our first endpoints so that we can actually start storing some of these project objects. So we want these endpoints to create a new project item. We want it to also allow us to view that item or view multiple items. We want an endpoint to allow us to update the item if we ever needed to, or delete the item altogether. So the first thing that we're going to do before we do those endpoints, we need to import a couple more things from the Flask library. So we're going to come up here, and after Flask, we're going to say also import the requests and JSONify. Request is going to allow us to request that data, and then JSONify is going to allow us to read whatever the user is typing in at the other end of our application. So if they type in a title, we're going to be able to read that. If they type in a new link, then we're going to be able to read that as well. So once we're done with that, let's come underneath here, underneath our project schema, and we're just going to keep this part at the very end of our project, so don't mess with that. So right here, we are going to create our first endpoint. So let's just make a little bit of a note. We are going to say that this will create a single project, and we are going to use that decorator and say my app, just like we did with our very first test route. And now we're going to say app.route, and we're going to do that / and then we're going to say project. So whenever they have this endpoint, we want it to have a post method. So we're going to say methods equals, and it's going to be looking for something called post. And that is it for that line. Now let's create a new function to actually add that project to our database. So we're going to say add _ project. And again, that JSON object is going to have the title and link stored like a dictionary. So whatever the user created will be stored in it. So let's store it in our own variables. So let's call this just title, and equals request.json, which are the two dependencies that we just imported. And we are going to look for whatever that title was that the user typed on the front end of our project. And then we are going to do the same thing for link. So link equals request.json, and then we want it to look for the link. We will create a new variable that calls our class so that we'll send it the new title and that new link. So we're going to say new project equals our project class. So project dot, sorry, not dot, we're going to send it our title and whatever that new link was. Now that we have those, we're going to actually store those inside of our new database. So we're just going to say db.session.add. And what do we want to add? We want to add that new project. And then when we do db.session.commit, this will actually save the project itself. So that's being saved inside of our database. Now let's test to see if it's actually storing something. We will query our project item by using the get function, which will expect an ID. So we're going to say project equals our project dot query dot get, and we're going to say that new project dot ID. Now we're just going to return our JSONified version of our project item. So we're going to return project schema dot JSONify whatever that project is. Okay, so let's go ahead and test that. We are going to come back in here. Make sure that you're still inside of your shell, your pipenv shell. If you're not, just say pipenv shell. And I'm going to say Python. Now the name of my file, which is now my first flask.py. And it looks like I spelt methods wrong. Yep, I spelt it with an O instead of an E. Okay, let's run that again. Okay, and now it says that my debugger is active. And now we're going to test this in Postman. If you look at the description down below, I will give you a link to download Postman. It only took me less than a minute to install, so it should be pretty easy for you. But once you have it downloaded, go ahead and open it up. And here is Postman right here. And the first thing that you'll see is a page like this, okay? So what we're going to do is that we're going to go right into create new, and we are going to say HTTP request. And inside of here, we are going to kind of act like we are the front end of our project. So if this is a website, this is going to request some data or post some data or delete some data, stuff like that. So we are going to put in the URL. We are going to put in our local host, and it's 5,000 in my case, /, and then the name of your endpoint, which is project. So I'm going to do / project, and we're going to make sure that this changes from get to post, because that is the method that we are saying to do. So whenever we have this endpoint and it's post, that means it's going to create something, okay? And now we are going to click on body, and then down here, we're going to go to raw, and then we're gonna change this text down to JSON, so it's easier for us to read, okay? Now inside of here, again, we're going to pretend like we are in our front end of our project, whether that's an app or a website, and we are going to create this little object right here. And I need to give it a title, and I can call this project 1, comma, and now let's do a second key value pair. Let's see, the other one was link, so we need to say link. And now put in some kind of link. I'll just do google.com for right now. And let's go ahead and push send. Now, if you did it correctly, it should say everything down here. So that is now inside of our database. Now, how you know that it worked is that it says a status code of 200, and that's good. If you ever get like a 501 or 400, then you might have some kind of server error. You can even look at your project and it will say what's wrong inside of your project, okay? So make sure your debugger is active and running before you do this. And if you have any errors, you can always rewind this video and check to make sure that you typed everything out. As you saw, I did have a couple of bugs myself with some typos, and I already fixed those, so that's not a problem. So now I want to be able to view all of these projects. So we're going to create our next endpoint. So underneath this endpoint, let's create another little note and say this endpoint will query all the projects in our database. Okay, so we're going to do another route. So my app.route, and then the name of this endpoint is going to be / projects with an S, because we want to be able to create all of those, comma, let's do methods. I'll spell it correctly this time. And I'm going to say get. So this will be a get request. And let's create a function, and let's have it be get projects with an S. And we're going to call this variable all projects equals project dot query dot all. So that should query all the projects, and then we are going to store it in some results. So result equals projects, make sure you have the S, schema dot dump, and we just wanted to dump all projects. So that's a function that will dump everything so that we can see everything, and then we're going to return that JSONified version of the results. So return JSONify result. Okay, So we'll kind of make sure that there are no errors here. So now let's go ahead and test this and make sure that this is working. So Python, my first flask.py, and debugger is active, perfect. So now we can test this. Now we're going to change this into a GET request because that's what we wrote for this endpoint. And the name of this endpoint is projects with an S. So let's do projects with an S. And if I hit send, this should now tell me what is in there. Now this is actually sending me everything. You can see that this is a list. It should give me multiple items if I have multiple items. And just to make sure it's working, let's create a new post. So post, and let's change this to project. And I'm gonna call this project 2. And I'm going to send it. So it looks like it worked. And we have a status code of 200. Now let's do a GET request and see if we can grab all of those projects now. Hit send, and now you can see project 1 and project 2. So this is working very good so far, but what if we want our application to only show one project at a time? Let's say that we click into a project and we want it to expand and let us see deeper into it. Then we do need to make a new endpoint to grab one project at a time. So let's create another one just under here, and we're going to say this endpoint will query a specific project. So we're going to say my app.route, and we are going to give this a route of /project, that's singular, / and we're actually going to give it the ID. So if you remember giving it an ID up here, okay, remember that every time we create a project, it's going to assign that ID and increment every single project. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it'll just keep going. So whatever the ID is, we don't know at the time, so we're going to do this dynamically. And we're gonna do these opening and closing ankle brackets, and inside just put in ID. So whatever the ID is, it's going to grab that. So we're gonna do methods. This is also going to be a GET request. And let's create our function. And let's just call this GET project. And we're going to send it that ID. And we're gonna store that ID inside of project. So let's do project equals project dot query dot get whatever the ID is. And then finally, we're just going to return it. So we're going to say return project schema dot JSONify the project. So this should return that individual project. And let's go to Postman and make sure it works. Let's start up our server first. And it says debugger is active. I don't have any errors, so I'm going to come back to Postman. It's also going to be a GET request. Now I've already created 2 projects, so I should have one that is ID1 and ID2. So let's do project singular /1. So hopefully this will be my project 1 because that was my very first one. So let's go ahead and send it. And there it is, project 1. Now if I say do the project that has an ID of 2, there's my project 2. But if I try to do something that's project 3, well, I don't have 3 projects, so it shouldn't work. And now you can see that it did work. It did say 200 okay, but there's nothing in it. So that's some important behavior to pay attention to, whether it's just empty or if there's an actual error or not. So sometimes you want to actually update an item. Let's say that this is some kind of social media post like Facebook, and you already made the post, but what if you want to change the title or change the picture or the description? Then we want to be able to update an existing project. So if we had, let's say, project 1, we want to be able to update that. So let's come back over here to our project and let's create a new endpoint. And we're gonna say this endpoint will update a specific project. So let's create a new route, and I'm going to say my app.route, and you can see that this is starting to be a little bit repetitive. So you should be able to start to remember how we're doing this. Let's call this route project, and we also want to get that ID because this is going to be that specific project, whatever it is. And we're going to do methods, and what we're going to do for this is something called a put request. So this will allow us to replace any differences in our project. So if the title changes, then this will change it to that current ID. And so let's create a new function. Let's call this project update. And let's send it the ID. And what we're going to do is that we are going to set each item for that project, such as the ID, the title, and the link. So we'll say project equals project dot query dot get whatever the ID is. And then we are going to set that title to the new title. So we need to do a request.json, which will get whatever that new title is that the user is updating. And then we're going to do the same thing in case they change the link. So request.json link. But if the user didn't update these, it's going to grab it anyway. Just whatever the link is on the front end, it's going to update it inside of the database. So let's take that project title and we'll set it to that new title. And we'll do the same thing for the link, project.link, and we'll set it to that new link. And now we want this to actually be saved inside of the database. So let's do db.session.commit. And then let's return project schema.jsonify project. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to Postman after we run our debugger. Okay, debugger is active. Let's go to Postman. And what we're going to do is that we're going to do a put request. Okay, and the endpoint, remember, is just project ID. So it's the same thing. So let's grab our first one and let's change something inside of the title. So instead of project one, like it says in my first one, we're going to say my first updated title, and then updated1.com for the link. So let's go ahead and send that and see what happens. Okay, and it says I have some kind of error. So let's go back to my project and see what's going on. It says request is not defined. So I spelled request wrong somewhere. So let me go ahead and find that. And we have request over here. There it is. So request, I forgot the E. Okay, so let's change this again. Debugger is active. So let's just hit send. Okay, got another error. Okay, dict object is not callable. And it says it's on line 62. So title equals request.json equals title. Oh, it's because we did parentheses here. This is going to be a dictionary. So we want to query that by using square brackets. Okay, so we'll try that. So I'll go ahead and run that. Now it says it's active. Let's hit send again. Now it says that it worked. So it says 202 status, updated1.com, my first updated title. Let's do a get request and let's request all of the projects and see how it looks in our entire database. And there it is. We have our project 2, and then our first one changed from project 1 to my first updated title, and then the link from google.com to update1.com. So again, it doesn't matter if you do have some errors, you can just go back and fix those. You can follow that same process I just did, and that's not a problem. Now we want to do our very last one, which is going to delete one record at a time. And then once we have that, we will be done with this, and then you will have a fully functional API. So this endpoint will delete one record at a time. Okay, so let's create a new route. So let's say myapp.routes, and we are going to do essentially the same thing as before. We're going to do that single project. And as you may have guessed, we're going to select that specific ID so that it knows what to delete. And so we're going to say methods, and this method is called delete. And I just spelled that wrong. Delete. There we go. And let's do a new function. We'll call it project_delete. And we're going to send it that ID. So let's set up our project and let's set up that ID. So project.query.get whatever the ID of the current project is. And we are going to now delete it out of the database. So we're going to say db.session.delete. We're going to delete that whole project. And then we are now going to save our entire database by doing db.session.commit. And just always remember, commit will just save your database, and that'll be pretty easy for you to remember. And now we're going to return. I usually like to give the user some kind of validation that the project was successfully deleted. So we can use just like string interpolation saying, hey, this project with this ID was deleted, or you can just return the entire data or the entire project itself, JSONified version of it. But just to make sure that it's working, let's just use string interpolation in this case. So let's just say project with an ID of whatever the ID was successfully deleted. So if it ever says that, then it should be successfully deleted. Let's run our Flask. I don't see any errors. It's active. Now let's do a delete request, which is right here. And let's do project at, let's delete our project 2, which has an ID of 2. So let's do project 2 and let's send that. And I got a status of 200, so that worked. And it said project ID, and it gave us the ID, which is 2, was successfully deleted. Let's see if that's true. I'm gonna do a get request, and I'm going to request all the projects. And there's only one project left, and that is my first one. So that is working. So we've tested our post request, which allows the user to save a new project. And then we did a get request for each individual item. And then we did a get request for all the items. And then we did a put request, which allows us to update, which all worked. And then finally, we did a delete request, which allows us to delete one project at a time. So congratulations if you went through that. You have successfully created your own API. You can literally copy and paste this into another project, maybe change a couple names like title or link, depending on what you're trying to store. And then make sure that you don't just do that, but you do need to create your dependencies and import your new files for your database file and your pip files and everything, and that should work for you just fine. So thank you so much for tuning in. I will go ahead and edit this video so that it's a little bit faster for you, and I will have this up on YouTube. If you have any requests or suggestions for my next video, then please let me know down in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe so that you are notified whenever I come out with my next tutorial. Thank you so much and have a wonderful rest of your day. Happy coding.